When the man in the $8,000 suit laughed in Judge Caprio's face, the entire courtroom went silent. What happened in the next 60 seconds would wipe that smirk off his face forever. But to understand why this moment became the most satisfying takedown in courtroom history, you need to know who this man really was. His name was Richard Castellano, 52 years old, real estate developer, net worth somewhere north of $40 million. And on this particular Tuesday morning in Providence, he stood before Judge Caprio for what he considered a joke, a parking violation. $150. Pocket change. But Richard didn't come to pay. He came to make a point. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is beneath both of us. That's how he opened. Not with an apology, not with an explanation. With condescension dripping from every word. Judge Caprio looked up from the paperwork, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He'd seen thousands of defendants. Rich, poor, young, old. But something about Richard's tone made him pause. Mr. Castellano, you're here because you parked in a handicapped space outside City Hall. Is that correct? Richard smiled, not a friendly smile, the kind of smile that said he'd already won. Technically, yes, but let me explain something to you, Your Honor. I was attending a city council meeting, a meeting about a development project that will bring 300 jobs to this city. I was running late. There were no spots available, so I made a judgment call. He said judgment call like he was doing the city a favor. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair. The courtroom was packed that day. People waiting for their own cases, a few lawyers, some Providence residents who just liked watching the proceedings. They all felt the tension building. A judgment call, the judge repeated slowly. And did this judgment call take into account the person with an actual disability who might have needed that space? Richard's smile didn't falter. Your Honor, I was parked there for 11 minutes. 11 minutes, the chances of someone needing that specific spot in that specific 11-minute window are statistically negligible. He actually said statistically negligible, like he'd done the math, like he'd risk-assessed someone else's needs against his convenience and decided he mattered more. Judge Caprio removed his glasses. That's when the people who watched his show regularly knew something was coming. He always removed his glasses before he got serious. Mr. Castellano, do you know why handicapped parking spaces exist? Richard waved his hand dismissively. Of course, for people with disabilities. I'm not arguing against their existence, Your Honor. I'm simply saying that in this one instance, the pragmatic choice was to use an empty space for a brief period during important city business. The word pragmatic hung in the air like smoke. Judge Caprio nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He looked past Richard to the courtroom gallery. Is there a Mrs. Eleanor Santos present? An elderly woman in the third row raised her hand hesitantly. She was maybe 70 years old, using a walker to stand up. Judge Caprio gestured for her to come forward. Richard's expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of confusion. Mrs. Santos, thank you for coming today. Can you tell the court what happened on the morning of October 8th? The woman's voice was soft but clear. I had a doctor's appointment at City Hall for my disability benefits review. I can't walk very far because of my hip replacement. When I got there, the handicapped spot was taken by a black Mercedes. I had to park 3 blocks away. Richard's jaw tightened. She continued. It took me 20 minutes to walk those 3 blocks with my walker. I was late for my appointment. They almost didn't see me. I almost lost my benefits because I was late. The courtroom was silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. Judge Caprio looked at Richard. Mr. Castellano, Mrs. Santos was the person who filed the complaint about your vehicle. She took a photo of your license plate because she was so exhausted and in so much pain by the time she reached the building that she sat down and cried. And while she was sitting there, she saw you come out, check your watch, and drive away. Richard's face was reddening now. Your Honor, I had no way of knowing. 11 minutes, Judge Caprio interrupted. You said 11 minutes like it wasn't very long. For you, in your luxury car, living your life without physical limitations, 11 minutes is nothing. For Mrs. Santos, those 11 minutes meant 20 minutes of pain, nearly losing her benefits. and dignity lost in tears on a city hall bench. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The smugness was cracking, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Now, Mr. Castellano, I've done some research on you. Your company, Castellano Development Group, has made quite a bit of money in Providence. You've built luxury condos, shopping centers. You mentioned 300 jobs. That's impressive. Richard's posture straightened slightly. Maybe the judge was coming around. Thank you, Your Honor. We do take pride in— I also learned, Judge Caprio continued, his voice hardening, that 2 years ago your company was required to include accessible housing units in one of your developments. Units for people with disabilities. The city mandated 12 units. Do you remember what happened? Richard's face went pale. Your Honor, that was a complicated— You lobbied to reduce that number to 4 units. You testified before the zoning board that requiring 12 units wasn't economically viable. You fought for 6 months to cut accessible housing by 2/3. And you won. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Caprio raised his hand for silence. So let me make sure I understand your philosophy, Mr. Castellano. When it benefits your profit margin, accessibility is too expensive and statistically unnecessary. But when it inconveniences you personally for 11 minutes, accessibility is also unnecessary because you're too important to be bothered. Do I have that right? Richard's lawyer, who'd been standing silently beside him, finally spoke up. Your Honor, my client is here for a parking violation, not to discuss his business practices. Judge Caprio turned to the lawyer with a look that could freeze water. Counselor, your client made this about character when he walked into my courtroom and suggested his time was more valuable than the dignity of disabled citizens. So yes, we're going to discuss character. He turned back to Richard. Mr. Castellano, here's what's going to happen. The fine for parking in a handicapped space is $150. That's what the law says, but the law also gives me discretion. So here's my ruling. Everyone lean forward. You're going to pay the $150 fine, but you're also going to pay an additional fine of $5,000. Richard's eyes went wide. $5,000, Your Honor, that's— I'm not finished, Judge Caprio said, his voice like steel. That $5,000 will be donated directly to the Rhode Island Disability Rights Coalition, an organization that fights to protect people like Mrs. Santos, people whose needs you find statistically negligible. Richard was shaking now, not from fear, from rage. This is outrageous. I'll appeal this. My lawyers will— You can absolutely appeal, Judge Caprio said calmly. That's your right. But let me tell you what will happen if you do. This case will become public record in detail. The media will cover it, and everyone will learn about how you fought against accessible housing while parking in handicapped spaces. Everyone will know that you made an elderly woman cry on the steps of City Hall because 11 minutes of your time mattered more than her ability to walk. He paused. Is that the headline you want attached to your next development project, Mr. Castellano? Because I promise you, I will make sure every city council member, every zoning board, and every community organization knows exactly who you are. The color drained from Richard's face. He understood now. This wasn't just about money. This was about reputation, legacy, future business deals, everything. Judge Caprio leaned forward. Or you can accept this ruling with grace, pay the fine, and maybe learn something about humility and compassion. Your choice, friend. 30 seconds of silence. Richard looked at his lawyer. His lawyer subtly shook his head. Don't appeal. Don't make this worse. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll pay the fine, Your Honor. Good, Judge Caprio said. But there's one more thing. Richard looked like he might pass out. You're going to apologize to Mrs. Santos right now in this courtroom. Richard turned slowly to face the elderly woman. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. The man who'd been so confident, so dismissive, so certain of his superiority, now looked small. Mrs. Santos, I apologize. I was thoughtless. I caused you pain. I'm sorry. It wasn't eloquent, but it was real. You could hear the humiliation in his voice. Mrs. Santos nodded quietly, her eyes wet. Judge Caprio looked at Richard one last time. Mr. Castellano, you came into this courtroom thinking you were above the rules, that your wealth, your status, your important business made you special. But in here, everyone is equal. The law doesn't care about your bank account, and neither do I. He picked up his gavel. Case closed. Next. Richard walked out of that courtroom $5,150 poorer. But more than that, he walked out exposed. The video of the exchange went viral within hours. Local news picked it up, then national news. Within 2 days, Castellano Development Group released a statement announcing they would voluntarily add 8 additional accessible units to their next project, beyond the city requirements. They called it a commitment to inclusive development. But everyone knew what it really was: damage control. Because Judge Caprio had done something remarkable. He'd taken a parking ticket and turned it into a lesson about power, privilege, and accountability. Mrs. Santos later told a reporter that she couldn't believe what happened. "I just wanted to report the car," she said. "I didn't expect all that." But when the judge made him apologize, when he made him see me as a person, not an inconvenience, I felt heard for the first time in a long time. That's what people miss about Judge Caprio's courtroom. It's not just about fines and violations. It's about dignity. It's about reminding people that rules exist to protect the vulnerable, not inconvenience the powerful. And when someone powerful tries to use that power to ignore the rules, Judge Caprio is there to level the playing field. The courtroom erupted in applause after Richard left. Judge Caprio didn't acknowledge it. He just called the next case. Because for him, this wasn't theater. This was justice. Real justice. The kind that says your money doesn't buy you permission to make other people's lives harder. 3 weeks later, Judge Caprio received a letter. It was from Richard Castellano. He didn't share the contents publicly, but sources close to the judge said Richard had written about perspective, about how that courtroom moment had forced him to confront his own arrogance, about how seeing Mrs. Santos, really seeing her, had changed something in him. Maybe it was sincere, maybe it was strategic, but either way, 8 more accessible housing units would exist because an elderly woman filed a complaint and a judge refused to let wealth override right and wrong. And that's the thing about Judge Caprio. He doesn't just punish, he teaches. He holds up a mirror and forces people to see themselves clearly. For Richard Castellano, that mirror reflected someone he probably didn't want to be. Someone who measured human dignity in 11-minute increments in statistical probabilities. But here's what makes this story matter beyond one arrogant rich man getting humbled. It's about what happens when systems work the way they're supposed to, when a judge has the courage to look beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of it, when someone in power uses that power to defend someone with none. Mrs. Santos didn't have expensive lawyers. She didn't have political connections. She had a walker and a camera phone and the courage to file a complaint. And because she did, because Judge Caprio listened, a man who thought himself untouchable learned he wasn't. That's the message that it went viral, not just the comeuppance of a smug millionaire, but the idea that the system can work, that judges like Caprio exist, that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary wealth and win, that dignity isn't for sale and justice isn't negotiable. Richard Castellano walked into that courtroom believing his 11 minutes were worth more than someone else's 20-minute struggle. He walked out knowing they weren't, and thousands of people watching online learned the same lesson. In a world where money often does buy special treatment, where the wealthy frequently avoid consequences, where accessibility is treated as an expense rather than a right, Judge Caprio's courtroom stands as something different. A place where your character matters more than your bank account, where excuses don't excuse anything, where "I'm too important to follow that rule" is met with "no, you're not." The clip now has over 20 million views. In the comments, people share their own stories. Times they've been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as inconvenient. Times they've seen privilege weaponized against the vulnerable. And they talk about what it means to see someone finally say enough. Because that's what Judge Caprio did. He said enough. You don't get to decide other people's needs are negligible. You don't get to make an elderly woman walk 3 extra blocks in pain because you couldn't be bothered to park legally. You don't get to fight against accessible housing and then violate accessible parking. You don't get to treat people as obstacles to your convenience. And when you do, when you stand before Judge Caprio with that smirk and that dismissive tone and that absolute certainty that your money makes you special, he'll remind you that it doesn't. He'll remind you in front of cameras, in front of the person you wronged, and in front of a world that's tired of watching people like you get away with it. That's the justice part, not just the fine, not just the apology, but the lesson, the public accountability, the moment where privilege collides with principle and principle wins. Richard Castellano probably still has his $40 million. He probably still drives that black Mercedes. But every time he sees a handicapped parking space, he'll remember. Every time he considers cutting corners or treating rules as optional, he'll remember. And every time he dismisses someone as statistically negligible, he'll remember the judge who made him apologize to the woman whose tears he caused. That's the power of Judge Caprio's courtroom. It changes people. Not always permanently, not always dramatically, but in that moment, standing before him, being held accountable, being forced to see the humanity in someone you've wronged, that changes you. Even if just for a moment. Even if just enough to make you think twice next time. And for Mrs. Santos, for people like her who navigate a world not built with their needs in mind, who face barriers and indignities and thoughtless cruelty from people who simply don't care. For them, seeing Richard Castellano humbled wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about being seen, about mattering. Judge Caprio gave her that. He gave all of us that. A reminder that justice isn't just about laws and punishments. It's about restoring dignity. It's about saying you matter to the people the world tells don't. It's about holding the powerful accountable and protecting the vulnerable. That's why this case resonated. That's why millions of people watched and shared and commented. Because somewhere in the back of all our minds, we wonder if the system still works. If the wealthy and powerful ever face real consequences. If standing up for yourself when you have nothing makes any difference at all. Judge Caprio answered that question. Yes, it does. Eleanor Santos filed a complaint and changed the city's housing policy. She stood up and made a multi-millionaire apologize. She mattered. Her pain mattered. Her dignity mattered. And Richard Castellano learned what Judge Caprio has taught hundreds of defendants. The rules apply to everyone. Your money doesn't buy you out. Your status doesn't excuse you. Your importance is measured not by your wealth or your achievements, but by how you treat people when no one's forcing you to treat them well. He failed that test, spectacularly, but Judge Caprio gave him a chance to retake it, to be better, to see clearly, to understand that 11 minutes of convenience isn't worth someone else's suffering. Will Richard remember that lesson 6 months from now, a year? Will he actually change? Maybe. Maybe not. But thousands of people who watched will remember. And the next time they're tempted to take the easy road, to ignore someone else's needs, to treat people as obstacles, they'll think about that courtroom, about that judge, about that apology. That's the real justice. Not just one man held accountable, but a million people reminded what accountability looks like, what compassion demands, what dignity requires. If you want to see more moments like this, where Judge Caprio holds people accountable and fights for the forgotten, subscribe to All Rise. This channel is dedicated to showing you that compassion and justice aren't opposites. They're partners. And in Judge Caprio's courtroom, they're both alive and well. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been dismissed by someone who thought they were too important to care? Or better yet, have you ever stood up to power and won? Share your story, because every Eleanor Santos deserves to be heard. And every Richard Castellano needs to be reminded that no one is above basic human decency. Thanks for watching. And remember, the next time you see that handicapped parking space, think about the person who might need it. Think about Mrs. Santos walking 3 blocks in pain and park somewhere else, because that's what good people do. That's what Judge Caprio would expect. And that's what makes us better than our worst impulses. Be the change. Show the compassion. Treat people like they matter. That's not just justice. That's humanity.